It is proposed here to show upon what principles and by what rules Greek and Roman society was governed. We unite in the same study both the Greeks and the Romans because these two peoples, who were two branches of a single race and who spoke two idioms of a single language, also had the same institutions and the same principles of government, and passed through a series of similar revolutions. We shall attempt to set in a clear light the radical and essential differences which at all times distinguished these ancient peoples from modern societies. In our system of education, we live from infancy in the midst of the Greeks and Romans and become accustomed continually to compare them with ourselves, to judge of their history by our own, and to explain our revolutions by theirs. What we have received from them leads us to believe that we resemble them. We have some difficulty in considering them as foreign nations. It is almost always ourselves that we see in them. Hence spring many errors. We rarely fail to deceive ourselves regarding these ancient nations when we see them through the opinions and facts of our own time. Now, errors of this kind are not without danger. The ideas which the moderns have had of Greece and Rome have often been in their way. Having imperfectly observed the institutions of the ancient city, men have dreamed of reviving them among us. They have deceived themselves about the liberty of the ancients. And on this very account, liberty among the moderns has been put in peril. The last 80 years have clearly shown that one of the great difficulties which impede the march of modern society is the habit which it has of always keeping Greek and Roman antiquity before its eyes. To understand the truth about the Greeks and Romans, it is wise to study them without thinking of ourselves, as if they were entirely foreign to us, with the same disinterestedness, and with the mind as free as if it were studying ancient India or Arabia. Thus observed, Greece and Rome appear to us in a character absolutely inimitable. Nothing in modern times resembles them. Nothing in the future can resemble them. We shall attempt to show by what rules these societies were regulated, and it will be freely admitted that the same rules can never govern humanity again. Whence comes this? Why are the conditions of human government no longer the same as in earlier times? The great changes which appear from time to time in the constitution of society can be the effect neither of change nor of force alone. The cause which produces them must be powerful and must be found in man himself. If the laws of human association are no longer the same as in antiquity, it is because there has been a change in man. There is, in fact, a part of our being which is modified from age to age. This is our intelligence. It is always in movement, almost always progressing, and on this account, our institutions and our laws are subject to change. Man has not in our day the way of thinking that he had 25 centuries ago, and this is why he is no longer governed as he was governed then. The history of Greece and Rome is a witness and an example of the intimate relation which always exists between men's ideas and their social state. Examine the institutions of the ancients without thinking of their religious notions, and you find them obscure, whimsical, and inexplicable. Why were there patricians and plebeians, patrons and clients, eupatrids and thetis? And whence came the native and the ineffaceable differences which we find between these classes? What was the meaning of those Lacedaemonian institutions which appear to us so contrary to nature? How are we to explain those unjust caprices of ancient private law At Corinth and at Thebes, the sale of land prohibited. At Athens and at Rome, an inequality in the succession between brother and sister. What did the jurists understand by agnation and by gens? Why those revolutions in the laws, those political revolutions? What was that singular patriotism? What was that singular patriotism which sometimes effaced every natural sentiment? What did they understand by that liberty of which they were always talking? How did it happen that institutions so very different from anything of which we have an idea today could become established and reign for so long a time? What is the superior principle which gave them authority over the minds of men? But by the side of these institutions and laws placed the religious ideas of those times, and the facts at once become clear, and their explanation is no longer doubtful if, on going back to the first ages of this race, that is to say, to the time when its institutions were founded, we observe the idea which it had of human existence, of life, of death, of a second life, of the divine principle, we perceive a close relation between these opinions and the ancient rules of private law. We perceive a close relation between these opinions and the ancient rules of private law, between the rights which spring from these opinions and their political institutions. A comparison of beliefs and laws shows that a primitive religion constituted the Greek and Roman family, established marriage and paternal authority, fixed the order of relationship, and consecrated the right of property and the right of inheritance. This same religion, after having enlarged and extended the family, formed a still larger association, the city, and reigned in that as it had reigned in the family. From it came all the institutions as well as all the private law of the ancients. It was from this that the city received all its principles, its rules, its usages, and its magistracies. But in the course of time, this ancient religion became modified or effaced, and private law and political institutions were modified with it. Then came a series of revolutions, and social changes regularly followed the development of knowledge. Then came a series of revolutions, and social changes regularly followed the development of knowledge. It is of the first importance, therefore, to study the religious ideas of these peoples, and the oldest are the most important for us to know. For the institutions and beliefs which we find at the flourishing periods of Greece and Rome are only the development of those of an earlier age. We must seek the roots of them in the very distant past. The Greek and Italian populations are many centuries older than Romulus and Homer. It was an epoch more ancient in an antiquity without date that their beliefs were formed, and that their institutions were either established or prepared. But what hope is there of arriving at a knowledge of this distant past? Who can tell us what men thought 10 or 15 centuries before our era? Can we recover what is so intangible and fugitive? Beliefs and opinions. We know what the Aryans of the East thought 35 centuries ago. We learn this from the hymns of the Vedas, which are certainly very ancient, and from the laws of Manu, in which we can distinguish passages that are of extremely early date. But where are the hymns of the ancient Hellenes? They, as well as the Italians, had ancient hymns and old sacred books, but nothing of these has come down to us. What tradition can remain to us of those generations that have not left us a single written line? Fortunately, the past never completely dies for man. Man may forget it, but he always preserves it within him. For take him at any epoch, and he is the product, the epitome of all the earlier epochs. Let him look into his own soul, and he can find and distinguish these different epochs by what each of them has left within him. Let us observe the Greeks of the age of Pericles and the Romans of Cicero's time. They carry within them the authentic marks and the unmistakable vestiges of the most remote ages. The contemporary of Cicero, I speak especially of the man of the people, has an imagination full of legends. These legends come to him from a very early time, and they bear witness to the manner of thinking of that time. The contemporary of Cicero speaks a language whose roots are very ancient. This language, in expressing the thoughts of ancient ages, has been modeled upon them, and it has kept the impression and transmits it from century to century. The primary sense of a root will sometimes reveal an ancient opinion or an ancient usage. Ideas have been transformed, and the recollections of them have vanished, but the words have remained, immutable witnesses of beliefs that have disappeared. The contemporary of Cicero practiced rites in the sacrifices, at funerals, and in the ceremony of marriage. These were rites. These rites were older than his time, and what proves it is that they did not correspond to his religious belief. But if we examine the rites which he observed, or the formulas which he recited, we find the marks of what men believed 15 or 20 centuries earlier. Down to the latest times in the history of Greece and Rome, we find the common people clinging to thoughts and usages which certainly dated from a very distant past, and which enabled them to discover what notions man entertained at first regarding his own nature, his soul, and the mystery of death. Go back far as we may in the history of the Indo-European race, of which the Greeks and Italians are branches, and we do not find that this race has ever thought that after this short life all was finished for man. The most ancient generations, long before there were philosophers, believed in a second existence after the present. They looked upon death not as a dissolution of our being, but simply as a change of life. But in what place and in what manner was this second existence passed? No, the doctrine of the metempsychosis was never able to take root in the minds of the Greco-Italians. Nor was it the most ancient belief of the areas of the East, since the hymns of the Vedas teach another doctrine. Did they believe that the spirit ascended towards the sky, towards the region of light? Not at all. The thought that departed souls entered a celestial home is relatively recent in the West. We find it expressed for the first time by the poet Phocylides. The celestial abode was never regarded as anything more than the recompense of a few great men and of the benefactors of mankind. According to the oldest belief of the Italians and Greeks, the soul did not go into a foreign world to pass its second existence. It remained near men and continued to live underground. They even believed for a very long time that in this second existence the soul remained associated with the body. Born together, they were not separated by death and were buried together in the grave. Old as this belief is, authentic evidences of it still remain to us. These evidences are the rites of sepulchre, which have long survived this primitive belief. But but which certainly began with it, and which enable us to understand it. The rites of sepulture. Old as this belief is, authentic evidences of it still remain to us. These evidences are the rites of sepulture, which have long survived this primitive belief, but which certainly began with it, and which enables us to understand it. The rites of sepulture show clearly that when a body was buried, those ancient peoples believed that they buried something that was living. Virgil, who always describes religious ceremonies with so much care and precision, concludes the account of the funeral of Polydorus in these words: "We enclose the soul in the grave." The same expression is found in Ovid and in Pliny the Younger. This did not correspond to the ideas which these writers had of the soul, but from time immemorial it had been perpetuated in the language, attesting an ancient and common belief. Virgil's description relates to the employment of cenotaphs. It was admitted that when the body of a relative could not be found, they might perform a ceremony which exactly reproduced all the rites of sepulture, and it was believed that in this way, in the absence of the body, they enclosed the soul in the tomb. It was a custom at the close of a funeral ceremony to call the soul of the deceased 3 times by the name he had borne. They wished that he might live happy underground. 3 times they said to him, "Fare thee well." They added, "May the earth rest lightly upon thee." Thus firmly did they believe that the person would continue to live underground, and that he would still preserve a sense of enjoyment and suffering. They wrote upon the tomb that the man rested there, an expression which survived this belief, and which has come down through so many centuries to our time. We still employ it, though surely no one today thinks that an immortal being rests in a tomb. But in those ancient days, they believed so firmly that a man lived there that they never failed to bury with him the objects of which they supposed he had need: clothing, utensils, and arms. They poured wine upon his tomb to quench his thirst, and placed food there to satisfy his hunger. They slaughtered horses and slaves, with the idea that these beings buried with the dead would serve him in the tomb, as they had done during his life. After the taking of Troy, the Greeks are about to return to their country. Each takes with him his beautiful captive. But Achilles, who is under the earth, claims his captive also, and they give him Polyxena. A verse of Pindar has preserved to us a curious vestige of the thoughts of those ancient generations. Phrixus had been compelled to quit Greece and had fled as far as Colchis. He had died in that country, but dead though he was, he wished to return to Greece. He appeared, therefore, to Peleus and directed him to go to Colchis and bring away his soul. Doubtless, this soul regretted the soil of its native country, and the tomb of its family. But being attached to its corporeal remains, it could not quit Colchis without them. From this primitive belief came the necessity of burial, in order that the soul might be confined to this subterranean abode, which was suited to its second life. It was necessary that the body to which it remained attached should be covered with earth. The soul that had no tomb had no dwelling place. It was a wandering spirit. In vain it sought the repose which it would naturally desire after the agitations and labor of this life. It must wander forever under the form of a larva or phantom, without ever stopping, without ever receiving the offerings and the food which it had need of. Unfortunately, it soon became a malevolent spirit. It tormented the living, it brought diseases upon them, ravaged their harvests, and frightened them by gloomy apparitions, to warn them to give sepulture to its body. and to itself. From this came the belief in ghosts. All antiquity was persuaded that without burial the soul was miserable, and that by burial it became forever happy. It was not to display their grief that they performed the funeral ceremony. It was for the rest and happiness of the dead. We must remark, however, that to place the body in the ground was not enough. Certain traditional rites had also to be observed and certain established formulas to be pronounced. We find in Plautus an account of a ghost. It was a soul that was compelled to wander because its body had been placed in the ground without due attention to the rites. Suetonius relates that when the body of Caligula was placed in the earth without a due observation of the funeral ceremonies, his soul was not at rest and continued to appear to the living until it was determined to disinter the body and give it a burial according to the rules. These two examples show clearly what effects were attributed to the rites and formulas of the funeral ceremony, since without them, souls continued to wander and appear to the living. It must have been by them that souls became fixed and enclosed in their tombs. And just as there were formulas which had this virtue, there were others which had a contrary virtue, that of evoking souls and making them come out for a time from the sepulchre. We can see in ancient writers how man was tormented by the fear that after his death, the rites would not be observed for him. It was a source of constant inquietude. Men feared death less than the privation of burial, for the rest and eternal happiness, for rest and eternal happiness were at stake. We ought not to be too much surprised at seeing the Athenians put generals to death who, after a naval victory, had neglected to bury the dead. These generals, disciples of philosophers, distinguished clearly between the soul and the body, and as they did not believe that the fate of the one was connected with the fate of the other, it appeared to them of very little consequence whether a body was decomposed in the earth or in the water. Therefore, they did not brave the tempest for the vain formality of collecting and burying their dead, but the multitude, who, even at Athens, still clung to the ancient doctrines, accused these generals of impiety and had them put to death. By their victory, they had saved Athens, but by their impiety, they had lost thousands of souls. The relatives of the dead, thinking of the long suffering which these souls must spare, came to the tribunal clothed in mourning and asked for vengeance. In the ancient cities, the law condemned those guilty of great crimes to a terrible punishment, the privation of burial. In this manner, they punished the soul itself and inflicted upon it a punishment almost eternal. We must observe that there was among the ancients another opinion concerning the abode of the dead. They pictured to themselves a region also subterranean but infinitely more vast than the tomb, where all souls far from their bodies lived together, and where rewards and punishments were distributed according to the lives men had led in this world. But the rites of burial, such as we have described them, manifestly disagree with this belief. A certain proof that at the epoch when these rites were established, men did not yet believe in Tartarus and the Elysian fields. The earliest opinion of these ancient generations was that man lived in the tomb, that the soul did not leave the body, and that it remained fixed to that portion of the ground where the bones lay buried. Besides, a man had no account to render of his past life. Once placed in the tomb, he had neither rewards nor punishments to expect. This is a very crude opinion, surely, but it is the beginning of the notion of a future life. The being who lived underground was not sufficiently free from human frailties to have no need of food. The being who lived underground was not sufficiently free from human frailties to have no need of food, and therefore on certain days of the year, a meal was carried to every tomb. Ovid and Virgil have given us a description of this ceremony. The observance continued unchanged even to their time, although religious beliefs had already undergone great changes. According to these writers, the tomb was surrounded with large wreaths of grasses and flowers, and cakes, fruits, and flowers were placed upon it. Milk, wine, and sometimes even the blood of a victim were added. We should greatly deceive ourselves if we thought that these funeral repasts were nothing more than a sort of commemoration. The food that the family brought was really for the dead, exclusively for him. What proves this is that the milk and wine were poured out upon the earth of the tomb, that the earth was hollowed out so that the solid food might reach the dead, that if they sacrificed a victim, all its flesh was burned so that none of the living could have any part of it. That they pronounced certain consecrated formulas to invite the dead to eat and drink, that if the entire family were present at the meal, no one touched the food. That, in fine, when they went away, they took great care to leave a little milk and a few cakes in vases, and that it was considered gross impiety for any living person to touch this scant provision destined for the needs of the dead. These usages are attested in the most formal manner. I pour upon the earth of the tomb, says Iphigenia in Euripides, milk, honey, and wine, for it is with these that we rejoice the dead. Among the Greeks there was in front of every tomb a place destined for the immolation of the victim and the cooking of its flesh. The Roman tomb also had its culina, a species of kitchen of a particular kind and entirely for the use of the dead. Plutarch relates that after the battle of Plataea, the slain having been buried upon the field of battle, the Plataeans engaged to offer them the funeral repast every year. Consequently, on each anniversary, they went in grand procession conducted by their first magistrates to the mound under which the dead lay. They offered the departed milk, wine, oil, and perfumes, and sacrificed a victim. When the provisions had been placed upon the tomb, the Plataeans pronounced a formula by which they called the dead to come and partake of the repast. This ceremony was still performed in the time of Plutarch, who was enabled to witness the 600th anniversary of it. A little later, Lucian, ridiculing these opinions and usages, shows how deeply rooted they were in the common mind. The dead, says he, are nourished by the provisions which we place upon their tomb and drink the wine which we pour out there, so that one of the dead to whom nothing is offered is condemned to perpetual hunger. These are very old forms of belief and are quite groundless and ridiculous, and yet they exercised empire over man during a great number of generations. They governed men's minds. We shall soon see that they governed societies even, and that the greater part of the domestic and social institutions of the ancients was derived from this source.